Okay, let's be honest. Whenever you hear people talking about inflation, it can feel like everyone is speaking a different language. Some people are freaking out about prices at the grocery store going up, while others are talking about like deflation and the economy crashing. It's a lot.
It can be super confusing.
Yeah, for sure. And that's why we're doing this deep dive today. We're going to try to cut through the noise and look at some fascinating ideas from this finance expert, Kartik.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of him. He's got some pretty interesting
He
takes.
does. He does.
Yeah.
And he's going to help us reframe how we think about inflation. Like,
Mm.
he's got this contrarian view that challenges a lot of the conventional wisdom.
Right.
He actually argues that moderate inflation, might not be the monster we often make it out to be.
Yeah. And he even suggests that for many people, deflation might be the real thing to worry about.
Exactly. Like he's almost saying, hey, don't sweat the extra dollar you're spending on coffee. There are bigger fish to fry.
I like that.
Yeah. So to understand his reasoning, Kartik starts by comparing two different scenarios.
Okay.
So let's say your income goes up by 4%,
Mm-hmm.
but inflation is running at 6%.
Okay.
So it's like, you're taking one step forward and then half a step back.
Right.
You're still making more money, but it doesn't go as far.
That's a scenario that a lot of people are familiar with right now.
For sure.
Yeah.
It's definitely not fun, but as Kartik points out, it's manageable, especially when you consider the alternative.
Yeah.
So now imagine prices actually drop by 2%.
Okay.
That sounds amazing.
Like everything's on sale.
Everything is on sale.
Yeah.
Exactly. But what if at the same time your income plummets by 50% or even 100%
Ooh.
because you lose your job or the economy tanks?
Yeah, nobody wants that.
No, that's
Wow.
not good. And this is where Kartik's argument gets really interesting. He points out that deflation can kick off this vicious cycle. Demand falls, unemployment rises, prices drop even further, and the whole economy gets stuck in a downward spiral.
Kind of like what happened during the Great Depression.
Exactly, exactly. So in Kartik's view, a little bit of inflation might actually be a sign of a healthy economy, as long as it's, managed carefully.
Yeah. He actually argues that deflation is a much bigger threat, especially for the U.S., with all of its debt.
That's a really good point. And to illustrate this point, he brings up the housing market. Think about it this way. You've got a fixed-rate mortgage,
Mm-hmm.
and your monthly payments are manageable right now.
Right.
But then deflation hits, and suddenly your income shrinks, while those mortgage payments stay the same.
Ouch.
Yeah,
Yeah, deflation would make that monthly payment feel way heavier.
right.
And if you're someone who owns a home, deflation could actually increase your debt burden.
So it's like this double whammy. Your income is going down, and your debt is feeling bigger. Not a good combination.
Exactly. And this is where Kartik's comparison to inflation gets interesting. In an inflationary environment where we see rising home values, your equity actually goes up.
Right.
So even if you're paying a little more for groceries, your house could be worth significantly more, which is a nice cushion to have.
That's a really great point. And this is where Kartik brings up the idea of a quantitative easing, or
Right.
QE,
Right.
which we've all heard about.
Yeah.
So just to be clear, QE is basically when the Federal Reserve pumps money into the economy by buying bonds.
Right.
This lowers interest rates and encourages borrowing and spending, which can stimulate the economy.
Right. And Kartik suggests that QE might have actually contributed to the recent surge in home equity.
Interesting.
So on the one hand, QE might be fueling some of the inflation that people are worried about. But on the other hand, it's also created this windfall for many homeowners.
Yeah, it's like a hidden benefit that a lot of people don't even realize they're experiencing. But Kartik also acknowledges that, this isn't a win for everyone. What about the folks who are renting? They haven't benefited in the same way.
That's a very important point, and Kartik addresses that as well. He believes that direct cash payments could be a more equitable way to stimulate the economy
Right.
and ensure that everyone benefits, not just homeowners.
It sounds like he's really trying to make us think about the bigger picture here, not just fixate on the rising prices of, everyday things.
Exactly. He wants us to consider the impact on asset values, debt burdens, and these long-term economic trends. And it's a really fascinating perspective that challenges a lot of the common assumptions about inflation.
So it sounds like we need to be looking at the full picture and considering all sides of the equation.
That's exactly what Kartik is encouraging us to do. He wants us to look beyond just the grocery store and understand how these economic forces are playing out in different areas of our lives.
So let's dig into some specific examples that illustrate Kartik's points. He uses some really interesting charts to help visualize this. One of the charts that really caught my eye was the one that shows the total net worth of Americans, like as a percentage of GDP. And remember, this is factoring out inflation, so we are looking at real wealth growth.
Yeah, what's striking about this chart is that while GDP has grown steadily over the past decade, net worth has actually grown even faster. This means that on average, people are becoming more prosperous.
That sounds pretty positive. But I also remember Kartik mentioning that wealth is becoming very concentrated at the top. So it's not like everyone is benefiting equally
Well,
from
duh.
this, right?
You're absolutely right. While overall wealth is increasing, the distribution isn't exactly equitable. But Kartik's point is that the solution isn't to suppress wealth creation, but rather to find ways to encourage greater circulation of wealth so that everyone benefits.
So kind of like spreading the wealth around more evenly. I'm guessing this is where his ideas about direct cash payments and other policies come in.
Exactly. But for now, let's stick with these charts because they really help us understand the dynamics at play here. Remember how we talked about the housing market being especially sensitive to inflation and deflation? Well, Kartik uses another chart to really drive this point home. This one tracks mortgage debt as a percentage of GDP, alongside home prices.
And when you put those two things side by side, what jumps out at you?
Well, the thing that's really striking is how the housing crisis of the late 2000s caused this huge spike in mortgage debt, while home prices were plummeting. It was this really dangerous combination that could have triggered a deflationary spiral. That downward spiral we talked about earlier. It could have been like the Great Depression all over again.
Oh, wow.
But thankfully, the Federal Reserve stepped in with quantitative easing.
So QE saved the day.
Well, it's not that simple, of course. QE has its pros and cons, and we'll get into those a bit more later. But what Kartik highlights is that QE has actually led to a very favorable situation for homeowners.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How so?
Well, if you look at the chart, you'll see that since the Fed started pumping money into the economy, home prices have bounced back really strongly, while mortgage debt has actually gone down.
Wait, so the gap between those two lines on the chart, that represents home equity.
Exactly. And as we saw in the previous chart, that increase in home equity has played a major role in the overall growth of net worth.
So if I'm following correctly, Kartik is suggesting that even with its flaws, QE might have inadvertently created a wealth boom for homeowners.
That's one of the surprising insights he's highlighting. He actually points out the irony of people complaining about, having to pay more for gas while they're sitting on hundreds of thousands of dollars in extra home equity.
Yeah.
It's like they don't realize those two things are connected.
Okay, so there's a real disconnect there. But let's be fair. QE has been criticized for having some negative side effects, right?
Yeah.
Didn't Kartik mention something about it, like distorting the housing market?
He did. He argues that by focusing on mortgage-backed securities, which are basically bundles of mortgages that are traded like bonds, the Fed is artificially inflating housing costs at the expense of other sectors of the economy.
So it's like they're pushing up the price of housing, which might be great for homeowners, but it could be making it harder for other people to afford to buy a house.
That's right. And this is where his criticism of QE comes into play. He believes that QE is widening the gap between homeowners and renters because renters don't benefit from rising home values in the same way.
And this ties back into his idea of direct cash payments as a more equitable way to stimulate the economy without, making that gap even bigger.
Exactly. It's all about finding a more balanced approach.
So we talked a lot about housing, but what about the impact of inflation on other areas of the economy? What about things like, wages and savings?
That's a great question, and it's something that Kartik addresses as well. He points out that in an inflationary environment, wages tend to rise, though not always at the same pace as prices. So even though things might cost more, you're likely earning more too. It's all about that balance, right?
Right. It's like a constant race between your income and the cost of living.
Yeah.
But what about savings? Doesn't inflation eat away at the value of your savings?
That's a common concern, and it's true that if your money is just sitting in a, low interest savings account, inflation can erode its purchasing power over time. But Kartik argues that this highlights the importance of investing your savings in assets that tend to outpace inflation, like stocks or real estate.
So it's not just about how much you save, but also where you put your savings.
Exactly. Inflation can actually be an incentive to invest your money wisely and grow your wealth rather than just letting it sit idle.
So far, we've been exploring Kartik's argument that moderate inflation might not be as bad as we think, and that deflation could actually be a bigger threat, especially for a debt-heavy economy like the U.S.
Ooh, yeah, and if we circle back to what we discussed earlier about quantitative easing and the Fed's, attempts to manage inflation, Kartik makes a really important point. He suggests that even as the Fed tries to control inflation, they need to be incredibly cautious not to tip the economy in the other direction,
Yeah.
towards a deflationary spiral.
Because, as we discussed earlier, that could be disastrous, especially for an economy like ours that's carrying a lot of debt.
Exactly. It's like walking a tightrope, Kartik
Yeah.
is essentially reminding us that economic policymaking is a delicate balancing act.
It's about finding that sweet spot between too much inflation and too little.
Right. And that sweet spot might not always align with the prevailing narrative, which often demonizes even modest increases in prices.
So, if I'm hearing you correctly, Kartik is urging us to take a more nuanced view of inflation, to consider both its potential benefits and risks, rather than simply reacting with fear to every uptick in prices.
That's a great way to sum it up. He's challenging us to think critically about the economic forces at play and to question the conventional wisdom, especially when it comes to something as complex and impactful as inflation.
And what does this all mean for you, the listener? Next time you hear someone complaining about, the rising cost of a gallon of milk or a loaf of bread, think about Kartik's perspective. What if the real threat lurking in the shadows is actually deflation?
It's definitely a thought-provoking question, and it highlights how sometimes the things we fear the most might not actually be the most dangerous things we face.
We hope this deep dive into Kartik's ideas has helped you gain a deeper understanding of this complex issue and encouraged you to think a little differently about inflation and deflation.
And remember, the journey to financial knowledge is an ongoing adventure. Don't stop here. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those brain cells firing. I